mean, cool, fun, and informative.
Cool, fun.
About the state budget.
Hey,
I can make it fun.
There we go.
fun. I put the fun back in.
Fungible.
Yeah, fungible.
I put the fun in fungible. That's very good.
That may be the episode title. Putting the fun in fungible.
Put the fun. Putting the fun in fungible with JBC Chair Jeff Bridges. Sorry, it absolutely will be now. Okay. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest today. He has captivated audiences for over 6 decades with his versatile performances across more than 70 films. From his breakout role in The Last Picture Show to his iconic portrayal of the Dude in The Big Lebowski and his Oscar-winning turn in Crazy... Sorry, what? Oh, that's the wrong one. Okay, sorry. He's a member of the Colorado State Senate and the chairman of the powerful Joint Budget Committee, representing Senate District 26 after serving 2 terms in the Colorado House. State Senator Jeff Bridges, not Oscar-winning actor Jeff Bridges, worked for then U.S. Senator Ken Salazar after graduating from Arapahoe High School and earning a master's in divinity from the Harvard Divinity School. That's right, Ivy League boy is here today to explain why on earth we're cutting over $1 billion from the state budget despite not really having a $1 billion revenue shortfall, among other things. Jeff Bridges, welcome to the Get More Smarter podcast.
Hey, the highlight of my life so far is that I got onto Jeff Bridges' Wikipedia page. If you go to his Wikipedia page, you will see the top line for the Colorado politician. Click here. I've made it, guys.
Nice.
You're in the
I'm the second most
disambiguation.
famous Jeff Bridges.
Well done.
We need to find out if anyone's ever asked him about the Colorado budget.
If they have, it's been in the context of who's that guy at the top of your Wikipedia page?
We did learn that you're not a frequent listener to the podcast before we started recording, but did you know that we've interviewed, I think, 4 other Jason Baines for the show at various points?
4?
Yep.
There's more of us than you would think.
Yeah, there's only one Ian Silveri, though, unfortunately, for my Google search results.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm very hard to find. It was great when I first ran for office.
Yeah, you had high name ID.
Well, I had high name ID, but you couldn't actually find anything that I'd done if you Googled me. I was buried in the search results very deep. Now I pop up a little more. If you type Jeff Bridges, Colorado, you get a lot more of me these days than you used to. Apologies to people who are looking for, El Duderino.
The Dude, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm not into the whole brevity thing, but I do like the Eagles. True story. Before I ran for office, I would reply. So I have the Twitter handle at Jeff Bridges.
Right.
And so before I did this, I would just reply to people who missed at it, like they would. I just reply with Big Lebowski quotes every time.
That happened. That had to happen a lot, right?
All the time. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. No, and it's just
It still does, right?
It almost never. So the coach, there's this troll who has millions of followers on Twitter.
3-year Letterman. He rules.
He's 3-year Letterman. He got in a fight with Lauren Boebert, and he insisted that the star of Dances with Wolves at Jeff Bridges was much better than her. And so I replied, and I said something like, I'm just a dude, not the dude. And we had a whole back and forth. And I've been to Pigeon Forge, and I put a picture up of me at Dollywood. It was wonderful. It was the most likes I've ever received on any post on my page was
This is just
the
because you
3-year
have
Letterman
the same
troll.
name as a famous guy. That's amazing.
It works. I'll take it. It's at least 5 points in every election, right?
All right, well, we're not.
I like that guy.
Believe it or not, we're not here to talk
That's
about
not why we're here.
the Oscar-winning actor.
That's right.
We're here to talk about the state budget. I think Jason's going to kick this one off.
Yeah, all right. I'll try to get serious here. The best way, I think,
Yeah.
to help our
hard
listeners
with this. We keep it light.
understand the state budget might be to take it piece by piece. So let's do the 30,000-foot view. For our listeners, what are we talking about when we talk about the state budget, and what are we not talking about?
So there's different pieces of the state budget. The full Colorado state budget, when you take into account federal funds and all the various different sources of money that we come in, is about $40-ish billion. Really, though, what we talk about as legislators is what's called the general fund. So that is the money that comes in as Colorado taxpayer dollars, also fees A lot of people think we're raising fees because we can't raise taxes. The fact is, in a TABOR refund situation, fees are the same thing as taxes for us. They're all under the TABOR cap. So it's not like a way to get around unless there's an enterprise. So anyway, we're talking about the general fund. It's about $16.5 billion this year. And that is really what we have control over here in the state. If you look at something like Medicaid, a whole lot of Medicaid is federal dollars coming in to match what it is, usually at a 90-10 rate, what it is that we're spending on Medicaid. If you look at, for instance, the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, minuscule part of the Colorado General Fund budget, huge federal dollars coming in. The feds pay the salaries of all of our National Guard men and women.
Used to.
So, well, for now, the Guard is still getting paid. Doge hasn't made it to the military-industrial complex just yet. So, we're really just talking about that $16.5 billion. Now, you want to zoom down a little bit more and say what is in that 16.5. A third of that, about 4.5 billion, is Medicaid. That's the biggest piece of the general fund budget. Another third, again, roughly about 4.5 billion, is K-12 public education, and then the rest is that other third. So you look at that, and it's about 7% for prisons, 11% for higher ed, 4% for state courts, 10% for human services, which is behavioral health care and disability services and elderly services. So really, that's like all of the budget right there. That's the entire budget. You look at the Department of Ag. Department of Ag is $22 million. So the fact we have to cut about $1 billion this year, we could entirely eliminate the Department of Ag, and we'd still have to cut roughly $1 billion from the state budget.
Damn. What are some of the
We're not cutting the department. Let me be clear. We're not eliminating the Department of Ag. They do very important work. They also have a lot of federal funds that come in to support their work. So we're not cutting the Department of Ag. Love those folks.
What are some of the things that are like mandatory spending obligations that you kind of already put to the side that aren't part of your discussion?
That's a really good question, because it sort of depends on what you mean by mandatory. Right? K-12 is mandatory according to Amendment 23, but more than 10 years ago, we decided we were going to create the BS factor, the budget stabilization factor, and essentially just underfund schools according to what Amendment 23 said we had to. And for some reason, the Supreme Court said that was constitutional. I don't agree with that decision. I think that the BS factor is BS. I sort of considered it the unconstitutional factor. We eliminated that for the first time in more than a decade last year. No more budget stabilization factor for K-12. Fantastic. Just unbelievable that we were able to do that. Amendment 23 has a certain requirement for spending. Categoricals have to go up by a certain amount every year. The base funding in K-12 has to go up by a certain percentage. And then you look at something like prisons. What we fund for prisons is essentially just a function of how many people are in prison. And there are certain things we can do to adjust that dial. But fundamentally, if you're not paying what it costs to keep those prisoners safe, then you're also putting the officers in jeopardy. And it's a safety question. And so it's really just a factor of how many folks are there, how many folks does it take to keep those people safe. And so that's a math equation mostly with prisons. You look at higher ed, and that's probably has traditionally been seen as the most flexible piece in the budget, because if you reduce what you invest in higher ed, then you can presumably the institutions of higher education will just make that up in higher tuition, right? We also at the state level set what that tuition is, though. How much are they allowed to increase that? And there's been over the last few years of the governor's office a disagreement about how much those institutions actually need, both in terms of revenue they get from tuition and in terms of revenue they get from the state. So, we as the budget committee have generally tended to side with the numbers that we get from the institutions of higher education as opposed to the numbers from the gov's office. Even though he's very pro-education, I think he sees a lot of admin support at higher ed that he would prefer that they spend on students. That's his perspective. We have a different perspective on the JVC.
So what's the total general fund that you guys are looking at for it's the
16.5 billion.
And of that 16.5 billion, it seems like you've got to find 1.2 billion or so to cut. Is that right?
We have to find 1.2 billion to cut to get to that 16.5. So that $1 billion cut is essentially if we copy and pasted what we did last year, which includes increases for provider rates in Medicaid, what we spent, what we invested in higher ed, what we invested in K-12. Essentially, if we take all the investments we made last year and we did that again this year, we'd be in the hole by about $1 billion.
So I'm sure that you could answer this question and we could have no other discussion for the rest of this podcast, but why?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really short answer. Tabor.
Oh. Well, please, can you give us the long version of that?
Are you surprised by this?
I thought you said you weren't into the brevity thing.
It was an extremely leading question. It is what I thought you would say, but please elaborate for listeners. Why is Tabor because it's not revenue, right? Like we have basically enough money coming into the state to fulfill all the obligations, including the increases in the Medicaid providers, including the, spending that legislators just want to do on programs and stuff. Why is Tabor the reason why, despite not being in an economic downturn, we have to cut the budget from last year to this year?
I had a preacher at Divinity School who was head of the Memorial Church. He was my advisor for a little while. And he would say this Boston Brahmin accent, a very successful line in the church. He would say, "The good news is that the church has all of the money that it needs. The bad news is that it's in your pockets." And when it comes to Tabor, the good news is that the state is actually already collecting all the revenue that we would need to fund K-12, to fund higher ed, to fund Medicaid. The bad news is that because of the rationing contained in Tabor, we have to give it back.
Right.
So what's the one-to-one? Like how much in refunds or other Tabor obligated funding has to go back out the door versus this $1.2 billion cut you guys have to perform?
Well, the complicated answer to that is that because we know that we have all of this money above the Tabor cap, we have put in a lot of tax credits so that we are investing those dollars back into programs we believe in and helping those folks that we believe need help, whether that's the earned income tax credit that we dramatically expanded last year.
This is for working families to give them a big tax break, right?
Exactly. The child tax credit for parents to make sure that they can afford to take care of their kids.
We're going to get a new one of those this year. Hell yeah, baby Sam.
Yeah, there you go.
Dollars.
Congratulations. Yeah.
You get one
by
too.
the way, incredible picture of Brittany there at the Capitol with your new kid. That was amazing that she flew out there for that vote.
Thanks, man. We're all still gobsmacked by the whole goddamn
that was a
thing.
Stunt baby, by the way.
Yeah. You have no. Are you like reading her fucking Twitter replies? Because there's like a whole conspiracy about that not being a baby or the baby. Don't get me started, man. It's so bad. I never should have gone. I never should have looked. Anyway, all right. So EITC, child tax credit. What other funding? So just to explain for listeners,
we actually also last year. Nobody knows about this. If your family makes $90,000 or less, we now have a tax credit that will cover the first 2 years of higher education.
Wow.
Done. Set. That is a tax credit that we have. We will refund those first 2 years if your family makes $90,000 or less.
That
huge, right?
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah,
it's pretty awesome. So those are the various different things we put into place because we knew that we would have these Tabor refunds. We'd have money above the Tabor cap. So the actual refund amount this year doesn't cover that full $1 billion shortfall.
Right.
But we wouldn't have put a lot of those programs in place if we knew
not for Tabor, because you're giving away the revenue proactively because you know you're going to have to do it in Tabor refunds. But Tabor allows the state legislature to use virtually any mechanism you want to either not collect the revenue in the first place or to refund the excess revenue above the cap. Is that right?
We're essentially creating tax credits here in the state that accomplish some of those progressive priorities that we have, like ensuring that folks can get a 2-year associate's degree or the first 2 years, their 4-year of school, paid for entirely.
So even though you've been able to see this coming and the legislature has made lots of policy decisions that use that additional revenue to invest in programs and services that we care about and like, how predictable was this current budget nightmare? Could you walk us through how we got here?
Sure. I think it's important to understand what the Tabor cap is and why it has this shortfall. So the Tabor cap is, and I'm going to use the visual here, even though I know it won't translate to your audio. Oh, well, some of your viewers. There you go.
Right.
So the Tabor cap is set at inflation plus population. So that's a pretty low slope in terms of growth. What we invest in as a government is a third of our budget. Again, Medicaid, Healthcare. Whoa, healthcare inflation way higher than the inflation on things like the cost of dishwashers and washing machines. We invest in wages. 90% of K-12 investment goes directly to wages. Wage growth is much higher than your standard inflation. You look at the cost of construction materials for roads. Those construction costs go up at a much higher rate than inflation. So when you look at what it is that we invest in as a state government, and you look at what it is that we're tied to with that Tabor cap, there's just not a relation. There's not a one-to-one relation. There's what's called a structural deficit. So the costs for what we invest in go up faster than the cap that we have, that rationing cap that we have inside of Tabor. And so year over year, functionally, even though the total dollar amount that we allocate in the general fund goes up, we have that difference between inflation and costs is essentially a cut that we have to make every year. This is a slow, self-imposed recession that the rationing in Tabor requires.
And this is by design, right?
State.
Like Doug Bruce
Absolutely.
designed Tabor to strangle
Evil
government
genius.
over time because the growth of the need for services is not represented accurately by a formula based on inflation plus population. It's just not.
Yeah. And so I would say that, this was passed in the early 90s. This is just one part of Tabor. This is not the you have to vote on tax increases part.
Right.
This is not the part that requires that those questions about tax increases be printed in all caps. There is so much in Tabor, right? This is one particular piece of Tabor that came in the early 90s, and no one budgets now the way they did in the early 90s. And the last time we were in the situation that we're in right now, where our budget was constrained in an ongoing way by this Tabor rationing, a Republican governor, Bill Owens, led the charge to pass Ref C and create a significant increase in that Tabor rationing cap.
So you guys have been putting away money into a reserve, a sort of rainy day fund for the last several years as well. But your JBC staff has noted that even if the economy continues apace, which I'm sorry to say because of Trump and Musk destroying everything, it might not or probably won't. But let's say even without a recession, Colorado looks like it could even exhaust that rainy day fund in a few years. Is that right too?
There's a difference between a reserve and a rainy day fund. The reserve is sort of our pseudo rainy day fund that we have in place if and when we hit that recession. It's not designed to be what it is that we go into when we just have our structural constraints that we have from something like
it's supposed to be for like a real economic downturn, right?
Exactly, right. And so when we look around at what's happening in the world nationally, when we look at all of these tariffs that are threatened, if not put in place, but even the threat of those tariffs has real economic impact, I am not at all certain that we are going to continue on the economic path we're currently on. So I think we need to preserve that 15% reserve for if and when the economy falters. There will be a recession. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know how bad it will be. We know for sure that the economy at some point will go back into a recession, and we need to be ready when that happens. Where we are right now, though, is that because of that rationing in Tabor, if we don't continue to make these cuts, if we don't have this sort of slow strangle, as you put it, on government, if we don't do that, then we would have to spend into the reserves. And if we did that, then we would be out very soon. So what you see is that growth in Medicaid is going to grow faster than inflation. And what that does is it pushes other things out of the budget. It goes from just under a third of our budget to a little over a third of our budget to an increasing percentage of what it is that we have to spend on that. K-12 also, because of Amendment 23, if we keep our commitment to schools, which we need to, that is the most important thing we do as a state, is we invest in public K-12 education. That continued increase in investment will continue to push out other things in the budget. And as much as there is always fat to trim. I will never say that the budget is perfect the way it is and there's no waste, fraud, and abuse, right? There's always something you can find. There's not $1 billion.
Right.
There's just not. And we do this for 1 year. We're going to find some of those programs. You do this for 2 years, you're going to find more. But even in this current situation, one of the cuts we made last week was we cut $1 million from what we give to food banks and food pantries. We went from 3 million to 2 million. And the staff recommendation was 1.5 million. And we said, no, we're just going to cut $1 million. Instead of cutting 1.5, we're just going to cut
That's
a
still
million.
a third of what you're investing.
Yes,
Doing the
that's a
math all by
third of the
myself
state
up here.
investment in food banking.
Yeah,
Yes,
no good.
you're a math guy, Ian. I can tell.
Well,
So,
calculator.
so
Let
we
me ask you about
that's
this
good.
thing. Congressional Republicans seem intent on trying to pass a federal budget that would make massive cuts to Medicaid, which some 1.3 million Coloradans rely on. What does that do to Colorado's budget if they do that?
Not good things. Very bad things. I mean, look,
does that mean Colorado doesn't have to put the money in?
Just like I hope this is clear. Like this, this is really heartbreaking work. This is not fun.
Yeah,
cutting $1 billion from the budget. The votes that we make, like, oh, let's cut services for folks with behavioral health challenges. Let's fund. The governor's proposal included a cut to what it is that we pay providers for autism services for kids. That was in the governor's budget. He was like, look, we're going to balance. This is something we have to cut. This is heartbreaking. This is there's some things you identify.
There's no safe bucket. There's no sacred cow. It's like everything has to get cut at least a little bit.
I mean, look, the way I put it is that the state budget is not like your home budget where there's an entertainment portion and you can just not go to the Dave Matthews concert and pay rent. We don't go to the Dave Matthews concert. We don't have that in our state budget. That doesn't exist. The cuts we make are painful and hard. And yeah, there are some things, right? One of the things we identified is that the Colorado Energy Office had a program where they spent $500,000 a year to increase the energy efficiency of marijuana grows. Fine. Great. Energy efficiency. Yay. All day long. Should we be spending $500,000 of taxpayer money on improving the efficiency of marijuana grows? Like, that's not a core government service. No, not at all. So there are some things like that where we can identify them and cut them. That was $500,000. There's not 1,999 more projects like that are just sitting out there in the budget waiting for us to find. This is cutting $1 million from food banks and food pantries. This is really brutal, hard work that we're doing.
And just to like clarify it, I know we already talked about this, but like if not for Tabor, none of this shit would happen. We would not have to cut $1 million from food pantries. We would not have to scale back investments on services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We would not have to do any of these things. This is purely because Tabor sucks. It has this cap, and we're over it, and it's ratcheting down essentially, right?
Yeah.
Great. Fuck Tabor.
Yeah, I think we can all agree there.
I would say, but just to put a little nuance on that, Ian, if we just if we could debruce immediately, that wouldn't solve all of our problems because we have all of those tax credits in place. But we wouldn't have put a lot of those tax credits in place if not for Tabor. So I don't want someone to come in and fact check me and say, actually, the refund this year is, that's not the world we're in. But essentially, yeah, we're budgeting. We are creating a state financial plan based on the constraints, the structural constraints, and rationing in Tabor.
So the Medicaid part, if the federal government cuts a bunch of funding for Medicaid, what does that mean for Colorado? Does that mean that Colorado has to pay less, or do they still have the obligations? What happens to our budget that way?
Yeah, I had
clear,
someone. What? Not great.
Is it not clear? We're not sure yet.
So, I mean, almost certainly what it means is that we have to kick people off of Medicaid. I mean, the federal decisions on this notion, I think, factually inaccurate claim that somehow cutting $880 billion from Medicaid won't have significant negative impacts on the people who depend on Medicaid is it's just not true.
How could it not?
There's no way you can do that.
Doge your way out of like the obligation that we have to spend money on largely seniors, kids, veterans, right? Like that's the largest population on Medicaid, or those three buckets of people.
I mean, the one of the really interesting challenges in Medicaid, one of the questions that I think we have to ask in an ongoing way is about the kinds of services that we provide. Because there's a very small percentage of people in Medicaid who account for the majority of the costs. And so long-term care, whether that's for the elderly, folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities or some other kind of disability, that care is the most expensive part of Medicaid. if we're just talking about going to the doctor, you broke your arm, you go into the hospital, you get the flu or asthma attacks, whatever. If you're just talking about sort of regular, average, everyday medical care, that's actually remarkably inexpensive. And we know the returns on that are sky high, right? If people go to a primary care person instead of waiting until they go to the emergency room,
Right.
we know that pays for itself. That's actually not the majority of what we spend in Medicaid.
Governor Polis has proposed restructuring nursing home provider fees to exempt them from the state revenue cap. Is that the kind of thing we should be doing?
Yeah. Yeah. You look at a lot of the legislation we've passed in the last few years, so here's a great example. Utah has increased their gas tax like numerous times since the last time Colorado increased their gas tax.
Right.
If we go to the voters and we say, hey, can we increase your gas tax? Hard no from voters.
No way.
At the same time, like Republican Utah understands that in order to get a return, you have to invest. And they have invested in their infrastructure. They have raised the taxes on gas in order to pay for it. And we in Colorado have fallen behind. I think anyone who drives here can see the conditions of our roads. And so a few years ago in the state, we created a gas fee. And that goes towards roads, bridges, multimodal, right? So that's how we're reinvesting. And we created a structure outside of the Tabor confines. We created an enterprise for those dollars to go into. And so we are looking at all the various different places that we can enterprise in order to continue providing the services to the people of Colorado that they have come to rely on and that I think they deserve.
It's essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while, and like dusting off my old 10-year-old chief of staff hat now, but it's basically you fucking believe it was that long ago.
Wow.
It
Ian,
is essentially a state.
It's been so
I don't know.
long.
We survived somehow.
Yeah,
but
good for
an
us.
enterprise is essentially a state-run business that has to spend the money it takes in on the same services it provides. It's fees, not taxes, and therefore it doesn't count toward the Tabor cap. Is that basically it?
Essentially, yeah. Although there are fees that do count towards the Tabor cap. So, for example, and this is crazy to me, but cheese is my favorite example for this, right? If you are a company and you want to make cheese, you are required to be certified by the state. So, in order to get certified by the state, you have to pay a fee to get the state to come out and
fee.
look at yeah, exactly. To look at your production facilities. And Leprino cheese, one of the nation's top cheesemakers, is here in the state. And if we just decided that we didn't want those fees to be counted against the Tabor cap, we would rather spend those dollars on K-12 public education, then Leprino would not be able to be certified to make cheese. And yet at the same time, the fees they pay to get that certification count against what it is that we can pay, what it is that we can invest in K-12 public education.
Oh, yeah, that's nuts.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, it is.
All right.
And there's nothing we can do about it, really.
I mean, we can change the structure that our state budget operates in, which is the only state in the entire country that has these kinds of fiscal constraints.
Right.
We will get there momentarily. I have one more question about the sort of federal-state interaction first. Are you at all worried about Trump and Elon Musk, I guess, because we have two presidents now for the price of one? Withholding federal funding from blue states, as he recently threatened to do with Maine when their governor told him that she wouldn't follow their bullshit executive order barring trans people from playing sports in high school and colleges. He literally said, you're not going to get any federal funding from us. Do you guys have concerns that they will just turn it off if we don't obey their unconstitutional nonsense?
To think that this president won't do the things that he says he will do, I think is to misunderstand this president.
He's a liar, but not in that way.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And he has been really clear about what it is that he's going to do. And I would, the fact that we have to rely on Congress to put the brakes on him, and Congress is what Congress is, it's a very scary world to live in. And a third of our state employees, we're looking at this government shutdown coming down the road. A third of our state employees are fully or at least partially funded by the feds.
I did not.
And if there's a government shutdown, what do we do with those employees?
A third?
A third, yeah.
How holy
Like,
yeah.
give us an example of like what kind of employee that how that would
And
work.
there's a lot of Medicaid folks. There's federal grants and programs like that. So
Okay.
some of these folks they're partially funded by the state, partially funded federally. And what do we do? We're already in a $1 billion budget shortfall. We're already staring down the barrel of potential massive cuts to Medicaid that we would do our best to try and make up for. And now this government shutdown. In past years, when the government has come back, everything's been paid back, right? Like they stop payment, they're shut down for a
Right.
month, for 2 months. When they come back, they back pay all of that stuff. I don't know that this president is the kind that would want to take care of the people who work for him.
Yeah, fair enough. Especially, the few of them that remain.
It's heartbreaking to see the sort of wanton dismantlement of programs and services that average working people, that Americans sort of across the economic spectrum depend on. And there's ways to do this. This is one of my frustrations too, right? If you wanted to go through and dismantle some of these programs, there's ways to do it within the existing structure of government that gives predictability and a real
Right.
assessment, and you don't end up cutting an anti-Ebola program, right? Like something that's actually could come and cause pretty significant
Or the
impacts on
people
the
who
United
oversee our
States.
nuclear stockpile, for example.
Yes,
Or the
exactly.
fucking
So
bird flu vaccine.
Right.
there are ways to do this that are responsible, and frankly, in a lot of ways, cutting $1 billion out of the state budget. That's what we're doing. We're combing through, and we are trying to find the programs that aren't
Yeah, but
delivering
you're
for the
not
people
doing
of
it with a
Colorado.
chainsaw and a blowtorch
No.
like Elon Musk. You're not going like ChatGPT, cut the budget by 1.2 billion, hit send. Like,
I think he
It's-
uses Gork.
that's worse. That's
Yes,
gotta be worse.
much worse. Yeah.
All right, so let's get into the Tabor thing. So
Can we
this
do
week-
that? Can we ask ChatGPT and Gork to cut $1 billion out of the state budget and see what the different answers? I'm gonna
Yep. Good luck.
see what the difference is.
I'm sure it's going to be horrible nightmare level shit, and it's all going to be like any DEI program. So Speaker, and there's not $1 billion of DEI in Colorado, to be very clear. So Speaker of the House, Julie McCluskey, friend of the pod, recently suggested that it might be time to reset the Tabor spending cap, sort of like this Bill Owens adventure in 2005 you discussed earlier, Referendum C. Can you explain in like somewhat relative plain English what that would entail and what your perspective is on a Ref C type solution or a different type of solution like a deep Bruce like you were discussing earlier? What's actually going to be the fix to this problem that we have, so we don't have to like come back and cut billions of dollars when we're not in a recession again?
I didn't know she was going to do that, and I saw the article and I was delighted.
Good.
I've been pitching my colleagues that we need to talk more about the structural deficit, the challenges we face. I actually find that it is helpful that we have Barb Kirkmeyer and Paul Lundeen in the Republican Senate caucus talking about the structural deficit. And they call it a structural deficit. Their solution is cut spending. My solution is change the structure.
Right.
It's got to be both, right? It is a combination. There are certainly things that we can cut spending on, but the structure itself needs to change because the long-term implications are disastrous. So what does that structural change look like? As I said, no one budgets today like they did in the 90s. Like that is, it's a different world. We have different costs. And so some kind of modernization, if all we did is said that the Tabor rationing ought to be tied to the actual costs of the investments that we make as a government, that would be a massive improvement, right? If we eliminated it entirely, that's another way forward. Another option would be the Ref C sort of pause, where we say we're just going to let it float for a while and then we'll reinstate it, and maybe we reinstate it with some new kind of percentage there. Part of the reason that we haven't been in this challenge since Ref C is that what Ref C said is basically it's a 5-year timeout. I think it was 5. And 2 years into that, we hit the Great Recession, and the amount of money in the budget fell off sharply even as the Ref C cap was raising. So we've just been on a slow collision course ever since. And over the last few years, we've actually been in a Tabor refund situation, but we had billions of dollars from the federal government that allowed us to essentially not have to make the kinds of serious cuts that we have to make this year. So, those are all the various different options that we could have. Another option that I know folks out there are talking about is restructuring Colorado's income tax. And instead of having a flat tax across the board, you have one that is a more progressive income tax. And as you ask that question, you debruce the revenue that we get from those
that's
dollars,
my
so that
preferred
those dollars don't count
solution and has
against the
been.
Tabor
I
cap.
think you can raise taxes on the wealthiest people in the state, cut them for 92 to 96% of the rest of us, debruce the state at the same time, and call it fucking good for the foreseeable future. Is that basically true, depending on how you do it?
And then we don't even have to talk about Tabor, because if you poll on just do you like Tabor, it's pretty good. I know I am.
I don't
risking...
see a problem asking people. At this point, it's baked in. Like, we need to accept the fact that Colorado voters are very, very used to weighing in on revenue questions. And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. And if you make a good enough pitch, like I would argue Jefferson County just did when they debruced the county by 15 points, having failed at doing so several times before because of language and other issues, like, you should be able to do that if you go to the voters. It's baked in. But this cap on the state level that's forcing these cuts in a basically, like you said, an artificial recession for no reason.
And I don't think people would have voted for that if they understood it in 1992.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful, though, when you talk about it to make it clear you're not talking about the voting on tax increases piece. Yeah. And so that's the danger, right, is that Tabor as a brand is strong.
I would run the campaign by saying, save your right to vote on taxes, save the state budget. Like, honestly, like, because that's what you would be doing at the same time. You wouldn't touch it. Like, we've lost if there ever was a fight around that, we lost it a long time ago. But this cap thing makes no sense to anybody. And when Jeffco and Arapahoe went to and RTD this last November went to their voters and said, like, hey, we have this problem that makes no sense to anybody. You're getting like a $9 property tax rebate check every couple of years, but we can't produce wildland firefighters if there's a wildfire in the rural parts of this county. Like, we need to fix this problem. People said, okay, sure. Sounds good.
What gives me hope on this is that when we explained what was happening with Gallagher to the people of Colorado, they understood and they supported it. We said that the massive increase in housing costs in the Front Range is causing rural fire departments to go bankrupt. People were like, I don't get it, but if you say the reasons, Gallagher, let's go. And so, I think that there is potentially a way forward on this that I would love to see. But if we go with, Ian, your preferred solution with the graduated income tax, I don't know that Tabor is part of that discussion, and I don't know that it's helpful to bring it in as part of it. I'm encouraging my colleagues to talk about Tabor and make it clear that the rationing piece of Tabor is not the voting on tax increases. It is this artificial structural deficit that is being created. And when the economy is booming, that's when you invest. Right. That is when you make those investments that pay dividends in the future. And right now, instead, we're tightening our belt. In a recession, sure, you tighten your belt. Everybody does it. Got it. Fine. But when the economy is doing as well as it is, we ought to be doubling down on making housing more affordable, on making sure that folks have the education they need for the jobs that we have in the state, that our economy is attracting good paying jobs across the economic spectrum. Like, this is when we ought to be doubling down on affordability in the state. And instead, we are cutting $1 billion.
Let's talk a little bit more about school funding. There's a bunch of leaders throughout the state are urging Speaker McCluskey to move forward with that new school funding formula for the next school year. Can you explain how this new formula is different, and can we still do it?
Yes, and yes. So yes, we can absolutely do it. The formula is different because, again, the current school finance formula, the one before this new one, was made in the 90s, and Colorado looked a lot different. I was still in K-12 in the 90s, and so it was a different kind of state, had different kinds of challenges, and frankly, we have dramatically underfunded English language learners and low-income students for decades in this state. And in fact, we would only give, if a kid is both an English language learner and low income, it used to be that we only gave a bump for one or the other. We know that if a kid is both of those things, it costs a lot more. It takes a lot more investment to get them to the level that we want those kids to be at. So I think, first of all, every kid in the state deserves the opportunity to succeed no matter where they come from, right? What their zip code is, what they look like. Every kid deserves the chance to succeed. What it takes for us as a public K-12 educational system to get those kids to that is different depending on that kid. And so that's where we talk about equity instead of equality, right? Like some folks are going to need more investment, and some folks aren't going to need as much. What the new funding formula does is it recognizes those differences. It also recognizes that it is more expensive to keep teachers employed in high-cost districts than it is in low-cost districts. And so, we take all of this into account. I think it's a student-centered formula instead of a district-centered formula. We are helping to support kids and making sure that the teachers and the school districts that are leading that kid on that educational journey have the support that they need to get that kid where we want them to be. So that is essentially the values difference between the old formula and the new formula. The new formula actually funds students the way that they need to be funded in order to get them to achieve where we want them to be.
Well, I'm glad to hear we can still do it. That's good. The JBC has traditionally...
Yeah, you've heard that, to the question, can we still do it? You've heard a lot of different takes on this, and some of the school districts say, oh, we can't afford it. I think there are lots of conversations happening right now, and friend of the pod, Speaker McCluskey, is neck deep in that, and I believe that she's going to come out the other side.
Now you're officially a friend of the pod. You were a friend of us individually before the pod, but now you are officially friend of the pod.
I was friends of Ian and Jason, and now I'm a friend of the pod.
Basically the last question, and after this we'll let you kind of go nuts and talk about any other parts of the budget you think we missed in this conversation. But thank you for spending so much time with us. I actually feel like I know a lot more about this than I did even when I was working there a decade ago. The JBC has tradition.
Can I interrupt real quick on that?
Yeah, of course.
So when I got onto the budget committee, like a month and a half in, I looked around and I went, oh, I actually understand state government now. The difference, 6 years legislating, I learned more in my first 2 months on the JBC about how state government works than the entire previous 6 years in the legislature. You dig in to every single department and you dig deep. And even especially this year, we're looking at all of the programs and trying to find savings across the board. Like the depth of understanding I have now about state government and where the dollars go it's incomparable. So I understand the chiefs of staff. It was adorable talking to my good friend, President Fenberg, about the budget, because he had no idea and he didn't really care. And, if you don't dig in, you don't get it.
Well, we had Janice May doing it for us when Dickie Lee was speaker, so I didn't have to learn it because she knew it inside out. And I was grateful for that for sure. Speaking of the sort of institution of the JBC, the Joint Budget Committee has traditionally produced bipartisan budgets, right? I mean, it's a 6-member committee.
The most bipartisan committee in state government, for sure.
Right, and it's 3 from the House, 3 from the Senate. Because you guys are in the majority, you have 2 Democrats from the House, 2 Democrats from the Senate, 1 Republican from each chamber as well. It seems to get a little harder every year as Republicans kind of insist that there's an imaginary pot of gold that Democrats refuse to unlock, or we can just magically cut spending and there's enough, so-called waste, fraud, and abuse to cover $1.2 billion. Do you think we're going to have a bipartisan budget this year? Where are conversations and talks? Do you have common ground forming right now?
I think so. I do. I think so. Barb Kirkmeyer is a very difficult and brilliant partner in this work. She knows more about so many of these various different pieces than just about anyone else in Colorado. Having worked at the local level and been in the governor's cabinet and now on JBC, she's an incredible resource, and it's terrifying because she knows so much, and she's wrong about many different things, and we definitely have disagreements, certainly on what it is that the priorities would be. But I think it's incredibly valuable having her there. And then Representative Taggart, the Republican from the House, he used to run Swiss Army. Like the guy's his corporate experience,
like
his
the
understanding of the budget. Yes.
I didn't know that. That's wild.
Yeah.
I don't think there is a Swiss Army.
Yeah, the military or the knife company?
No, not the knife.
Very good.
the suitcase, knife, etc. company.
Amazing.
It is pretty amazing. So his understanding of sort of budgetary processes and concerns, and it's pretty remarkable. There was a vote the other day where it was a 4-2 vote, still passes, and it was Barb Kirkmeyer and Emily Sirota that both voted no. And I sort of looked around and I went, what are the rest of us missing? Those are the two.
That's the JBC horseshoe, man. That's like the real.
Exactly.
That's the real size of the pillar. Anything else you think our listeners should know about the budget, the deficit, the refunds, Tabor, how it all comes together, that we didn't get to discuss? And again, thanks for spending so much time with us on this. This is a lot, but it's really valuable information.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway is the budget is extraordinarily complex, but the work that we do is extraordinarily bipartisan. And just like local governments say, there's no such thing as a Democrat or Republican pothole. Most of what it is that we deal with on the budget doesn't fall on partisan lines. It really doesn't. And it is a wonderful place for someone like me to be, who believes in the work of state government, that this is the place where we come together to do the things we can't do on our own. And to have that agreement on the other side that there is a purpose for state government. Our Republican members aren't here just to burn the whole thing down. There are Republicans in the House who are there simply to burn things down.
We know them well, yeah.
That's not the budget committee. And it is, I think, if we could have folks come and just hang out with us for a day and listen to the work we do, I think it would build an immense amount of trust in what it is that we do as a state government. It's extraordinarily complex and really deeply rewarding. I ran for this position. I asked to run the budget during this extraordinarily difficult year, and it's given me an ulcer, but it's also just unbelievably rewarding. So,
well, we wish you the absolute best of luck getting through it all, and thank you so much. If folks want to find you on the interwebs, where are your handles? What platforms are you on? Where can they follow you online?
My cell phone number is 303-358-5551. I put it in the Denver
real
Post.
Cell phone number. Yep, got it right here.
That's the one you got. It's the one both of you have in your phones, and that my wife has in her phone. That's my cell phone number. Put it in the Denver Post op-ed I wrote about the budget. I put it on every piece of mail that I've sent out so far. I don't know if my next campaign I'll do the same, but I think I will. It's important for folks to know they can get a hold of me if they want to. Yeah. So that's my cell phone. Email is jeff@bridgesforcolorado.com. Website's bridgesforcolorado.com. I'm on X. I don't like to go there anymore.
Sucks. But it's so bad.
Yeah. Ian, you may relate to this. We had about a year ago, Kit was born, and it was an extremely difficult birth. He came 2.5 months early, and I was so happy and grateful to have him, but it was such a challenge that I just, being in the NICU for 65 days and that was my life. I just left social media. I just didn't have the bandwidth to post about something that I voted on, in the morning, when at night I was going and doing some skin to skin with my kid while he stopped breathing a couple times. Right. So I actually am not as online as I used to be. I know I used to have a great social media presence, but man, it's been really nice not posting and not worrying about that. And,
I quit everything.
I might keep that going.
After Brittany got elected to Congress, I signed off all my personal stuff. We all co-manage the Get More Smarter platforms, but I had the same thing where it was I can't look at this shit anymore. But then the second Brittany got elected to Congress, it just became immediately horrible. The baby conspiracy is the least of the weird, horrible shit that we've had to deal with and look at. Jason has heard me grouse about this a lot over the years, and oh my God, sometimes it gets very, very bad. But
I want to push back that the baby was real and Brittany's fake.
I mean that would be.
Don't give him ideas.
The fact that a woman like that would marry a schmuck like me is evidence enough. But yeah. Anyway, state senator.
I think I said that during her goodbye roast on the Senate floor.
Yes, indeed. You were the jokes about me outnumbered the jokes about her by about 8-1. So we're grateful. But
because we love you, Ian.
State Senator Jeff Bridges, chairman of the powerful Joint Budget Committee, dad, friend of the pod, and friend of the state. Thank you so much for coming on the Get More Smarter podcast and explaining this to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good luck getting through it, man. It's going to be hard work.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.